Konnichiwa, or Ohio gozaimasu, or konbanwa, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you're watching this. Fellow Armchair Generals, we are playing again here as Japan. So let's continue this. Of course, we're racing through 1936 here. I'm trying to build up enough factories here so that I'll feel a little more comfortable in importing some Kaido. Because I would like to, some of the worst, including steel. Let's some imports going for that. Now we have synthetic oil factories. What I would like to see is something along the lines of the black ice model, in which you could build additional steel mines. Well, obviously they're iron mines, but as well as, I guess, foundries for creating the steel. Because during this time there was a real effort in Manchukuo by the Japanese to expand steel productions up here in this region. Japan, I guess, has some steel, but being a rather volcanic island and whatnot, it just doesn't seem to have a lot of natural steel resources. So to some degree you can, depending on the situation, you can expand, but there was a lot of expansion potential. And I don't know how best to handle this, because it shouldn't be entirely as expensive as a synthetic oil refinery to expand it, but not all iron mines are profitably expanded significantly. You know, sure, you can have a few more men in them and have a few extra tunneling shafts and whatever, and some of them and improve some of them, and if it's a pit mine type thing, you can have a few more trucks and a few more digging machines digging down in them, but you have a limited amount of expansion. But I do know that up here, and I don't have a good grasp, but I have read some that they were doing some major expansion at this time for some of the various resources in Manchuria, and of course like the U.S. for a lot of the resources, not all, but a lot of the resources, you have an unlimited amount of expansion, just because there's so much more. Just, you know, and they're of course still finding more. They're finding more in other places too, but okay, we have another one of these, some of those little submarines. Okay, we're gonna do something somewhat un-Japanese here. We're going to use. Okay, is this the? Oh no, we're gonna start. The Japanese saw the Oh, we still need one more, so we still have one more slot. Not need, but for our heavy cruiser, light cruiser. Why aren't we producing that we need? Oh, carrier fighters, okay. Oh, we've got our carrier, okay. Leave that for the moment. They saw the submarine very much as a element of the fleet, not as a commerce raider. They did understand that it could commerce raid, but that wasn't what their focus for the carrier, or I mean for the submarine. Let's look at air doctrines here. Strategic destruction, no. Good battlefield support. Not sure which I'm going to do, because I don't think we're going to do major strategic bombing operations as Japan, so that's out. But I'm looking at interception detection, fighter battling, interception, chain, ground support, fighter detection, air support, initiative, fighter, naval torpedo, that's good for Japan. Yeah, we're gonna go with this path. We'll try this path out. Fighters. What? Next is going to be industrial efficiency. That's a tough choice. Are these mutually exclusive? No, we can do both. Okay, that's good. That's probably where we're going to go next. So, it's going to be a while before we can do anything that's going to give us a air doctrine, I think. So, or naval doctrine. Ground doctrine. Okay, great battlefront. I guess that's good with that. Well, if we're going to build tanks, let's build a decent one. We'll build many, but we might need to be fighting China would be useful. Okay, hate this thing. Anti-Comintern Pact. Okay, Germany proposes that we sign a pact recognizing that the that the aim of the Communist International, known as the Comintern, is to I'm not going to read all this. Let's see. Improve relations with Germany. Yeah. We're going with industrial effort next. Infrastructure up and going here. Okay, now that we have a full production lineup +6 here, then we have a lot of needs here. And see, this is one thing that, well, I don't know how many, yeah, I don't know. I'm not a math guy. I think they're just all too, well, you know, how much aluminum to how much each of these are. So no one's buying our tungsten or chromium coming out of Manchuria mostly. Okay, well, let's see if we can see somebody around Asia. British, Raj, China. No, China is that. So let's go with North America. Okay. We just want. As you can see, North America has the U.S. has most of what we need here. It doesn't have rubber though. But Siam does, so we'll go with that. Any tungsten? No, we don't. Okay. Do we have steel? Yeah, we don't have putting it in it. You can see how the U.S. can be a major supplier to the raw material needs of Japan, and it was. U.S. made a big deal out about various aid once the war started, various aid programs, and the Japanese were buying a lot of scrap metal from the U.S. And if you look at the war movies of the period, once the U.S. got into, oh, it was I just got shot by part of a Chevy or something like that, because Japan was buying up a lot of the scrap metal, so they made a big deal out of that. But the U.S. had used trade as a weapon over its behavior in China. Now, it's not morally or legally wrong to do so. It's perfectly fine to do so. But yes, well, I'm going to go into a little modern comparison here. As well as, I don't know if any of you like to read science fiction, as well as other things. I've gotten to know a few of you back and forth, so I know a little bit about some of you. But I can highly recommend David Weber's books, particularly his Honor Harrington series. Rereading that for the umpteenth time, actually listening to it at my other job, audiobooks, but it has one of this character by the name of Reginald Houseman, sort of a guy who has his philosophy, but it's sort of wrong philosophy. But he very much is espousing, if reasonable men just got around the table and we come up with reasonable decisions, and you won't have these wars. Now, they're sort of dealing with a religious war, not anything that's based in our reality, but a religious war going on there. And that sort of espouses partially the progressivism, and there's a difference, and I don't know how much of you know this, there's a difference between progressivism and liberalism. not all progressives are liberals. There are conservative progressive and liberal progressives, and not all liberals are progressives. What's commonly found in America, a type of liberals that are not progressives, are called libertarians. That they are socially liberal, like, hey, do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting somebody else, but government stay out and stay away from micromanaging my life, kind of thing. Where the democratic liberals are often progressives as well. And progressives isn't just making progress, or isn't just for liberalism as in, hey, do what you want. And it isn't just we need to take care of the poor. It's a managing of society generally towards a generally, not always, but towards a communistic end goal. And I say communistic, not necessarily Marx and Engels, or even as modified by Lenin or Mao or anybody else, but as sort of this idealistic government-managed society and economics, generally towards a commonality or fairness in wages. So communistic viewpoint progressives have. But liberals, and you not necessarily all liberals, and you find this often in the modern American libertarian group, often shown heavily by Ron Paul, and that, well, if we hadn't been involved in the Middle East, they wouldn't have attacked us in 9/11, 9/11, wouldn't have happened. It was all not our fault that we were attacked, but they wouldn't have been, so it's partly our fault, because if we wouldn't have been messing with them, they wouldn't have felt the need to attack us. I'm sorry, no, they're not reasonable people. They're not people just simply reacting to our actions that they decided to need to attack us in that way. If we had, and maybe he means if we had simply said, oh, you're a Muslim country, we will allow 0 Americans into it, we will allow 0 economic interaction with it, we will seal you off as if you're sort of like North Korea, and then they wouldn't have attacked it. That might have been true. But if you allow international trade and you trade with the Islamic fundamentalist enemy, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that they want to overthrow, you're supporting the government, so they're going to attack you. When you see what these religious extremists, they're not reasonable men as a liberal understands the term of reasonable men. They are on a mission from God, as they see it. Well, getting back to where we started out here is, if you're going to use economics as a weapon of war to try to modify Japan's behavior towards China, well, you're making the one presumption that you're dealing with a quote-unquote, again, as they would see it, reasonable government of Japan. Meaning, oh, well, if you don't stop in China, we're going to stop selling you steel or oil or aluminum or whatever it might be. We're going to stop selling you that unless you modify your behavior, stop invading or whatever it might be. Well, Japan has taken a goal of, we're going after China. If you are hindering that goal of going after China, you're declaring war upon us, and if we see no other way, we're going to start killing you over this. Where the U.S. isn't thinking in those terms. Whether it is FDR or whether it is Obama, they just don't. These two presidents, and I see a lot of similarities there, and I also see, similarities between Obama and Chamberlain, because Chamberlain also comes out of World War I experience, and once reasonable men don't ever want to go back to those trenches. Reasonable men, reasonable leaders will do anything to avoid going back into the trenches of World War I and gas attacks and city bombing. Reasonable men will never go to that level, and Hitler and these other people must be reasonable men because the world is made up of reasonable men, so that they will we can do things but stop short of going back to those trenches. And so this is the reasonable men argument dealing with others, including people in government that you interact with, that you presume. And I'm not saying that these people are irrational in the sense that Japan, divine win and its God Emperor, that they believe somehow God, nature, whatever, is going to automatically sink American fleets and then Japan's going to be victorious. I'm not putting Japan into that sort of realm. They do make rationally based decisions, but their idea of reasonableness, similar with Hitler. Hitler was, up until the end, he wasn't. I mean, at the end he wasn't, but early on he was making rational decisions. But his reasonable menness didn't exclude going back into the trenches. He was willing to go back to that war. And Chamberlain and others thought that that was the last thing any reasonable leader would ever do. Well, that's not the case. Hitler was willing to do that. Japan is willing to attack the U.S. They weren't planning on conquering the U.S. I don't even know. I'm sure they would like the war aims of having the Hawaiian Islands to create a big, huge buffer out here from any aggression to its homelands, to create a big security zone. And so it might have wanted to take and keep some U.S. territory in that sense. But it had no war aims of conquering, occupying the U.S. in any way, shape, or form. It may have had a tactical element of taking over territory, but that would have simply been the prelude to negotiating a peaceful term. Withdrawing out back to what it sees as its sphere of influence. So Japan wasn't in the world conquering business. We can talk about maybe Hitler was or wasn't, but Japan wasn't. It was in the region conquering business. What would have been 100 years if later had they won, that's another story, but we don't know. So that they thought that they were being squeezed. Well, they were being squeezed, not thought, they were being squeezed. And their rational decision wasn't to modify its behavior in China. It was to attack the U.S. and Britain, who was currently bogged down, Britain, not the U.S. at the time, bogged down in a war with Germany, attack, get a strong position, and then negotiate a peace in which it can give up something. You see, it sees a similar sort of actions after its war with Russia, the Russo-Japanese War, in that wars aren't necessarily fought to the extinction of the other party or government or regime or anything like that. It's fought to a certain end, especially once they sunk the Russian fleet in the Straits of Tsushima. That now Russia ability to be victorious against Japan is gone, so now we've got to come to a peace agreement. But of course, if it was such a peace agreement that all of Russia's East Asian territories were claimed by Japan, would have kept Russia fighting. No, it was a peace agreement that was at Port Arthur down here. I believe this is Port Arthur or whatever. I may have that wrong, but some of the territories that that Russia had were turned over to Japan, some minor ones, and you had a peace settlement. That was Japan's view towards starting a war with the U.S. It was to sink the fleet. Now, of course, they didn't count on it being such a surprise attack that the American people felt betrayed, that they were enraged by. That was a mistake, and a few of them saw that the instant that it happened. Others really didn't until the end, until things came to an end. But when you see the world as a wishing to use soft power, you have to be very careful of how you use it, because it's one thing, I don't know, let's say Belgium to go, oh, you're behaving badly in China, so we're not going to allow Belgian companies to deal with you. Okay, well, yeah, Belgium may have some interesting resources down in the Congo here at the time, but it isn't a major world power, it isn't a major world bloc. It's just a sort of minor power, so somebody like Japan would shrug it off. And of course, if you're the reverse, if you're South Africa, all these people who don't believe in the Cuban boycott, and the boycott, how long has it lasted, and has it worked out, and we ought to end this thing because it's gone on so long and it hasn't worked out, and we should start trading with them because our years and years of boycott hasn't worked out, and we're hearing this from the Obama administration and all this other stuff. Would they have said the same thing about South Africa? Well, all these years of since there's apartheid, all these years of boycotting South African goods and blocking trade with South Africa hasn't worked out. Should we stop boycotts? No. They would argue the opposite with South Africa. It's a leftist versus a rightist. If it's going after a rightist regime, they are fine with boycotting it. If it's a leftist regime, they're not. No matter how bad the leftist regime is, they want to end boycotts against them. That's how they view the world. Now, South Africa never collapsed because of a boycott. And we may have a few South African viewers or whatever that want to give more detail on it, but South Africa was holding out on its own. The reason South Africa allowed the apartheid to go away was because of the fall of the Soviet Union. That's in my opinion. I may be wrong about that, but they believed, and I think correctly, that so long as the ANC, the African National Congress, was a puppet of the Soviet Union, they would get in power and not just bringing black majority rule to South Africa, they would bring communism to South Africa. And of course there are many racists in South Africa that still to this day abhor the idea of black men getting votes and things like that. And then there's other people that just think the black people, they're uneducated, so only the educated people should vote, and that's mostly the white people. Whether they see it as a racism thing or they just see it as an education thing. Again, I'm not an expert on the white populations in South Africa, and they vary between the English and then the Afrikaans populations and such, and what their feelings, how they view ethnicity, which is different than race, view ethnicity in South Africa today. But so if you are a minor power that has not the ability to take on a major power block that's being boycotted, that's one thing. It's another thing to go, we're going to boycott you. Your only way, and that is an attempt to get you to change your behavior. That could simply mean lashing out happens. So FDR's family had been involved with the China trade. It had a pro-China viewpoint, though it was a pro-modernist viewpoint. It was a European, or no, let me adjust that, pro-Western trade in China. And unlike the Europeans who wanted Western trade in China, they wanted quote-unquote free trade, meaning not trade zones, but they wanted to enforce the idea of trade with China, where the Chinese nationals weren't so keen on that. They wanted to trade what they wanted to trade and not be forced to allow international trade in if they didn't want to. They wanted to be able to put up trade barriers if and where they wanted to, for whatever reasons, good or bad. So there was a conflict there. But so the FDR mindset was pro this international trade, against trade zones. They sort of saw Japan taking over territories and setting up puppet states like Manchukuo and Menguko as a similar sort of situation of trade zones, and they wanted to modify that behavior. And since Japan was in its situation that it was, needing the trade, it doesn't hold that they're just going to roll over and acquiesce to your goals or objectives. They may go in the opposite way. So the U.S. is quite capable of putting an embargo against, say, Cuba or South Africa, and going, say, well, if you don't like it, who cares? Because if Cuba decides to send, if it has any submarines, I don't know if it does. South Africa did it for a while. I don't know if it still does. But send your submarines out and start sinking U.S. ships, or start flying your MiGs and bombing Florida or something. We're just going to come in and level you. You know, you aren't going to have any hope of winning that war. Similar with South Africa, it was for a time called Africa's superpower, and it was, or Sub-Saharan Africa, it was its regional superpower. But if it started to attack U.S. operated ships going around the Cape there or something, the U.S. would just come in and swat it like a fly. So you have to look at these power relations. So again, Reginald Haussmann, from the mentioned earlier from the Honor Herring series, says that wars are caused by the breakdown of diplomatic relations, and how diplomats just need to be reasonable and just need to come up with reasonable solution kind of things. Well, he's correct in that most wars are fought because not diplomats, but governments, which are different than diplomats, not just they don't read the signals correctly, but governments mistake other nations' willingness and intentions. I agree with that element of it. The U.S., now things changed by, 1941, late 1941, when Japan attacked the U.S. because Britain was sort of barely surviving, and Japan thought that it had a free hand. Japan saw, mistakenly, again a mistake, because the U.S., unlike Japan, culturally, is a democratic nation. It's a constitutional republic, of course, but in that the population can massively object to the government. So, meaning if the government goes, oh, they just sank our battleship out here in Hawaii. Oh, well, we don't have any navy yet left, so we're going to have to sign a peace agreement. And if you did that, let's say they had sunk the carriers, and they'd also, and it hadn't been a sneak attack. Well, maybe whether it's a sneak attack or not. But I'm not talking about the actual tactical attack, but the idea that the attack happening before the public announcement that we're at war, that element of it. But had they sunk the carriers, and had they destroyed the fuel supplies in Hawaii, and so that we had no ability to respond to them, and had FDR's government decided to sign some sort of peace treaty, even one that kept the Hawaiian Islands as U.S. territories at the time, and even if it meant fully withdrawing from the Philippines, fully doing that, but Japan still keeping Indochina and taking most or all of Indonesia, and maybe still at war with Britain. Had FDR's government did that, FDR's government may have fallen, he was very popular and everything, because the American people were so outraged at that time. The government couldn't, and it isn't quite like the UK, where they can sort of get rid of a prime minister or call new elections. We do it at regular sorts of bases, time period, you know, every 4 years. But still, you can put enough pressure that the president has to resign. Nixon. That was for a cover-up, not for the break-in, but for the cover-up of the break-in. He should have just said, these guys did wrong, these guys did wrong. But he tried to cover it up. So had Japan tried to do, or had the U.S. tried to realize it, that would have just enraged the U.S. population, and the U.S. government, as it was at that time with FDR, would not have survived. Whether, I don't know, quite honestly, I don't know who his vice president was at the start of the war. I know Truman came later, but I don't know. Whether it was his vice president or whether it would be the Speaker of the House taking over as president, and that the U.S. would not have, the U.S. didn't care. It had the ability to build fleets. If it would have taken 10, 20 years to build it, they were coming back to take out Japan by that point. It didn't matter. But Japan saw the world through its own eyes, in that if the government had a solid government policy, it would survive. It didn't understand the situation in the U.S., that it couldn't make the treaties. It couldn't accept this stuff. But if you had asked, when a lot of the and it was an increasing ratcheting up of sanctions against Japan, but if you had asked the U.S. and the U.S. population and government, by putting on these treaties, it's going to mean a war with Japan, they wouldn't have done it. They would have decided, we like China a whole lot. We wish they weren't doing that in China, but we weren't going to fight over China. And this comes partially to the mistake of the Japanese government in the sort of American first. Trump people, watch out using that America first buttons from the past. That's the anti-war people. Be careful who you're claiming to be. The America First and the other anti-war elements in Japan, in the U.S., were real, were strong, were significant, were very influential. But that isn't a pacifist movement. That isn't no war ever. That's don't get involved in war in China. Don't get involved in war in Europe. That isn't don't fight somebody who attacks us. If you attack us, oh, we're at war now, and we're going after you. That at least was nowadays, and of course in America. Hey, attack us all you want. We might get a little upset. We didn't. I'm surprised we still haven't really gone to war over 9/11. And Iraq wasn't over 9/11. It was over the no-fly zones and continuing to shoot down. And we thought they we thought, mistaken, we'll go into that some other time, but we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. That was a mistake. And invading Afghanistan isn't really going to war over 9/11. That's just piddling around. So the big actors in 9/11 were, of course, Osama bin Laden, that organized it up. But the people that he was operating for were dissident elements in Saudi Arabia, were the, I don't know if they have a particular name, but the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and these other radical groups that we are allowing. Hell, we supported the Muslim Brotherhood taking over Egypt for a while there, and I think our current government would still like them back in power. They don't like Assisi, but so we never really gone to war against Islamic fundamentalism. We've gone to war against the terrorists, meaning that's like, oh well, we're only going to go after those once they sign up to fight us, but those that are the government, and the government is the Islamic fundamentalist religious movement in this case, because it's a non-government, non-state actor. Well, Islamic State has a state now, but non-state actors, we still haven't gone to war over that. Used to be, if you attack us, we're going to war. The war's on. We're going in. And this is where Japan made that mistake, was to stay out of the war. It wasn't no wars ever. It was don't get involved in other people's wars. Once you make it our wars, then we're involved, and we are really involved. And another side note with it, it might not have happened. I mean, FDR definitely wanted to organize it so we were going to go to war with Germany. He was definitely working down that path. But it was Hitler's mistake to declare war on the U.S. It would have taken a lot more effort for FDR to go to war with Germany. It would have been a war against Japan while we supported Britain with more and more Lend-Lease type things. This is how I think it would have gone. Had Hitler, well, I don't know, I think eventually Hitler would have tried to go, they're all the same, they're all the Axis, they're all the evil, we must stomp them out. But it would have been months, if not years, before the U.S. would have gotten involved in the war against Germany, and a 3-month delay of actual U.S. involvements could have seen Egypt fall and other similar sorts of things. So could have been very different. Well, again, we're going to end with my continuing political diatribe against quote-unquote people who believe governments are reasonable and just make reasonable solutions and everything will be fine. You got to have a better understanding of your actions and their reactions to them. And notice, if you think that just because FDR and Obama are of the left, also is criticizing Chamberlain, who was the conservative prime minister of Britain, who is not purely a left or right Democrat Republican or liberal conservative, as in the, well, I guess it's Labour or conservative in Britain nowadays, viewpoint I'm talking about this sort of the belief that nations are not going to decide to go to war over like economic embargoes. They're only going to do that if they think if going to war is an absolute and complete and total loser, one, or two, if your embargo just isn't really worth it. Otherwise, they very well may decide that the best way out is a war. So, see you next time for more Hearts of Iron and maybe a few more of my ongoing talks. I know we didn't get very far this episode.